Welcome to the Spitzen-Körper Thelema. We are reading from Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled, the foundational text of Theosophy, published in 1877. This passage belongs to the second volume, where Blavatsky pivots from the history of occult science to institutional critique, specifically, the charge that the Christian Church was not merely opposed to magic, but practiced it extensively while condemning the same arts in others. This argument sits at the intersection of Enlightenment rationalism, romantic anti-clerical polemic, and esoteric reclamation. Blavatsky was writing in the aftermath of spiritualism's explosion across Europe and America. The Rochester knockings of 1848 had rippled outward into séance rooms, mesmerist salons, and public lecture halls. By the 1870s, phenomena that the Church had once monopolized as miracles were now reproducible, observable, and independent of ecclesiastical authority. For Blavatsky, this was not merely a historical irony. It was evidence of suppressed knowledge, and the Vatican itself was the archive of that suppression. The specific section we are reading concerns sortilegium, divination by lots, and the hypocrisy embedded in its condemnation. St. Augustine practiced it. Gregory of Tours confessed to it. Medieval bishops consulted the sorts sanctorum at episcopal consecrations. Yet when lay people performed the identical rite, it was condemned as sorcery, felony, and devil worship. Blavatsky cites actual church councils, Agda in 506, Orleans in 511, Auxerre in 595, Enam in 1110, each forbidding clergy from divination while enforcement against commoners intensified. The passage is polemical but densely documented. It belongs to the hermeneutic tradition of radical biblical criticism and the French anti-clerical Enlightenment, but filtered through Blavatsky's unique synthesis: occultism as suppressed science, ecclesiastical power as fear-based monopoly, and modern spiritualism as the return of what the Church tried to bury. Here is the text: from trial after trial, books and manuscripts confiscated from their sentenced victims, to their own profit. The Catholics may plead that the books were generally committed to the flames, that the treatises of famous sorcerers and enchanters perished with their accursed authors. But the Vatican, if it could speak, could tell a different story. It knows too well of the existence of certain closets and rooms, access to which is had but by the very few. It knows that the entrances to these secret hiding places are so cleverly concealed from sight in the carved framework and under the profuse ornamentation of the library walls, that there have even been popes who lived and died within the precincts of the palace without ever suspecting their existence. But these popes were neither Sylvester II, Benedict IX, John XX, nor the 6th and 7th Gregory, nor yet the famous Borgia of toxicological memory. Neither were those who remained ignorant of the hidden law friends of the sons of Loyola. Magic and sorcery practiced by Christian clergy. Where, in the records of European magic, can we find cleverer enchanters than in the mysterious solitudes of the cloister? Albert Magnus, the famous bishop and conjurer of Ratisbon, was never surpassed in his art. Roger Bacon was a monk, and Thomas Aquinas one of the most learned pupils of Albertus. Trithemius, abbot of the Spanheim Benedictines, was the teacher, friend, and confidant of Cornelius Agrippa, and while the confederations of the Theosophists were scattered broadcast about Germany, where they first originated, assisting one another, and struggling for years for the acquirement of esoteric knowledge, any person who knew how to become the favored pupil of certain monks, might very soon be proficient in all the important branches of occult learning. This is all in history and cannot be easily denied. Magic, in all its aspects, was widely and nearly openly practiced by the clergy till the Reformation. And even he who was once called the father of the Reformation, The famous John Rieuchlin, author of The Mirific Word and friend of Pico di Mirandola, the teacher and instructor of Erasmus, Luther, and Melanchthon, was a Kabbalist and occultist. The ancient sortilegium, or divination by means of sorts or lots, an art and practice now decried by the clergy, is an abomination, designated by Stat. 10 Jac. as felony, and by Stat. 12 Carolus II accepted out of the general pardons, on the ground of being sorcery, was widely practiced by the clergy and monks. Nay, it was sanctioned by St. Augustine himself, who does not disapprove of this method of learning futurity, provided it be not used for worldly purposes. More than that, he confesses having practiced it himself. But the clergy called it sorts sanctorum, when it was they who practiced it, while the sorts Braniston, succeeded by the sorts Homerus and sorts Virgiliane, were abominable heathenism, the worship of the devil, when used by anyone else. Gregory de Tours informs us that when the clergy resorted to the sorts, their custom was to lay the Bible on the altar, and to pray the Lord that he would discover his will, and disclose to them futurity in one of the verses of the book. Gilbert de Nogent writes that in his days, about the 12th century, the custom was, at the consecration of bishops, to consult the sorts sanctorum, to thereby learn the success and fate of the episcopate. On the other hand, we are told that the sorts sanctorum were condemned by the Council of Agde, in 506. In this case again we are left to inquire, in which instance has the infallibility of the Church failed? Was it when she prohibited that which was practiced by her greatest saint and patron, Augustine, or in the 12th century, when it was openly and with the sanction of the same Church practiced by the clergy for the benefit of the bishops' elections? Or, must we still believe that in both of these contradictory cases the Vatican was inspired by the direct Spirit of God? If any doubt that Gregory of Tours approved of a practice that prevails to this day, more or less, even among strict Protestants, let them read this. Lendastus, Earl of Tours, who was for ruining me with Queen Fredegond, coming to Tours, big with evil designs against me, I withdrew to my oratory under a deep concern, where I took the psalms. My heart revived within me when I cast my eyes on this of the 77th psalm. He caused them to go on with confidence, whilst the sea swallowed up their enemies. Accordingly, the Count spoke not a word to my prejudice, and leaving Tours that very day, the boat in which he was, sunk in a storm, but his skill in swimming saved him. The sainted bishop simply confesses here to having practiced a bit of sorcery. Every mesmerizer knows the power of will during an intense desire bent on any particular subject. Whether in consequence of coincidences or otherwise, the open verse suggested to his mind revenge by drowning. Passing the remainder of the day in deep concern, and possessed by this all-absorbing thought, the saint, it may be unconsciously, exercises his will on the subject, and thus while imagining in the accident the hand of God, he simply becomes a sorcerer exercising his magnetic will which reacts on the person feared, and the Count barely escapes with his life. Were the accident decreed by God, the culprit would have been drowned, for a simple bath could not have altered his malevolent resolution against Saint Gregory had he been very intent on it. Furthermore, we find anathemas fulminated against this lottery of fate, at the Council of Vars, which forbids all ecclesiastics, under pain of excommunication, to perform that kind of divination, or to pry into futurity, by looking into any book, or writing, whatsoever. The same prohibition is pronounced at the Councils of Agde in 506, of Orleans, in 511, of Auxerre in 595, and finally at the Council of Ennem in 1110, the latter condemning sorcerers, witches, diviners, such as occasioned death by magical operations, and who practiced fortune-telling by the holy book lots, and the complaint of the joint clergy against de Garland, their bishop at Orleans, and addressed to Pope Alexander III, concludes in this manner: "Let your apostolical hands put on strength to strip naked the iniquity of this man, that the curse prognosticated on the day of his consecration may overtake him." For the Gospels being opened on the altar according to custom, the first words were, "And the young man, leaving his linen cloth, fled from them naked." Why then roast the lay magicians and consulters of books, and canonize the ecclesiastics? Simply because the medieval as well as the modern phenomena, manifested through laymen, whether produced through occult knowledge or happening independently, upset the claims of both the Catholic and Protestant churches to divine miracles. In the face of reiterated and unimpeachable evidence, it became impossible for the former to maintain successfully the assertion that seemingly miraculous manifestations by the good angels and God's direct intervention could be produced exclusively by her chosen ministers and holy saints. Neither could the Protestant well maintain on the same ground that miracles had ended with the apostolic ages. For, whether of the same nature or not, the modern phenomena claimed close kinship with the biblical ones. The magnetists and healers of our century came into direct and open competition with the apostles. The Zouave Jacob, of France, had outrivaled the prophet Elijah in recalling to life persons who were seemingly dead, and Alexis, the somnambulist, mentioned by Mr. Wallace in his work, was, by his lucidity, putting to shame apostles, prophets, and the sibyls of old. Since the burning of the last witch, the great revolution of France, so elaborately prepared by the League of the Secret Societies and their clever emissaries, had blown over Europe and awakened terror in the bosom of the clergy. It had, like a destroying hurricane, swept away in its course those best allies of the Church, the Roman Catholic aristocracy. A sure foundation was now laid for the right of individual opinion. The world was freed from ecclesiastical tyranny by opening an unobstructed path to Napoleon the Great, who had given the death blow to the Inquisition. This great slaughterhouse of the Christian Church, wherein she butchered, in the name of the Lamb, all the sheep arbitrarily declared scurvy, was in ruins, and she found herself left to her own responsibility and resources. So long as the phenomena had appeared only sporadically, she had always felt herself powerful enough to repress the consequences. Superstition and belief in the devil were as strong as ever, and science had not yet dared to publicly measure her forces with those of supernatural religion. Meanwhile the enemy had slowly but surely gained ground. All at once it broke out with an unexpected violence. Miracles began to appear in full daylight, and passed from their mystic seclusion into the domain of natural law, where the profane hand of science was ready to strip off their sacerdotal mask. Still, for a time, the Church held her position, and with the powerful help of superstitious fear checked the progress of the intruding force. But, when in succession appeared mesmerists and somnambulists, reproducing the physical and mental phenomenon of ecstasy, hitherto believed to be the special gift of saints, when the passion for the turning tables had reached in France and elsewhere its climax of fury, when the psychography, alleged spiritual, from a simple curiosity had developed itself and settled into an unabated interest, and finally ebbed into religious mysticism, when the echoes aroused by the first traps of Rochester, crossing the oceans, spread until they were repercussed from nearly every corner of the world, then, and only then, the Latin Church was fully awakened to a sense of danger. Wonder after wonder was reported to have occurred in the spiritual circles and the lecture rooms of the mesmerists. The sick were healed, the blind made to see, the lame to walk, the deaf to hear. J. R. Newton in America, and Dupotet in France, were healing the multitude without the slightest claim to divine intervention. The great discovery of Mesmer, which reveals to the earnest inquirer the mechanism of nature, mastered, as if by magical power, organic and inorganic bodies. But this was not the worst. A more direful calamity for the Church occurred in the evocation from the upper and nether worlds of a multitude of spirits, whose private bearing and conversation gave the direct light to the most cherished and profitable dogmas of the Church. These spirits claimed to be the identical entities, in a disembodied state, of fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, friends and acquaintances of the persons viewing the weird phenomena. The devil seemed to have no objective existence, and this struck at the very foundation upon which the chair of St. Peter rested. The argument here is surgical. Blavatsky does not dispute that the Church condemned magic. She disputes only whom it condemned and on what grounds. The practice itself, sortilegium, divination, the exercise of will upon matter, was performed by Augustine, Gregory, monks, bishops, abbots. When ecclesiastics did it, theology reframed it, divine guidance, saintly inspiration, their will of God. When lay people performed identical operations, it became felony, devil worship, grounds for execution. What mutated this argument from early or anti-clerical polemic is Blavatsky's insertion of mesmerism and spiritualism as the historical proof. She does not argue theoretically that the Church was hypocritical. She argues that modern phenomena, the Rochester rappings of 1848, the healings of Newton and Dupotet, the magnetic passes of Mesmer, have made ecclesiastical monopoly on miracle impossible. The clergy cannot maintain that only saints produce wonders when magnetists are healing the multitude publicly, without prayer or sacrament. This grounds her case not in historical irony but in present observable fact. The Church's power depended on scarcity of the miraculous. Spiritualism flooded the market. The passage also seeds a deeper argument about the origin of doctrine. If Augustine and Gregory practiced sortilegium, and the Council of Agde condemned it, and a later council permitted it again, then Church infallibility is exposed as political convenience dressed in theology. This became foundational to theosophical historiography. Doctrine follows power, not truth. The archive, those hidden vaults Blavatsky mentions, contains not forbidden knowledge but forbidden evidence. Popes died without knowing what was shelved in their own library walls. The suppression was not accident. It was system. Next, Arthur Edward Waite, the Holy Kabbalah, the doctrine of divine names. The Spitzen-Körper Thelema. If this archive serves you, support it on Patreon. Link in the description.